Hey folks, this is Kelani. After all of the information we received in the Q&A on Thursday, it looks like the Alliance won't be getting High Elves anytime soon. That's why we have the Horde. But more importantly, it looks like the design decisions surrounding the global cooldown changes won't be changing anytime soon. The GCD changes are here to stay. They definitely seem to think this is going to be for the good of the game in the long term, so if you weren't too thrilled with the changes, it's time to buckle up, because BFA might be a bit of a bumpy ride for you. But just because it looks a little iffy on the surface, that doesn't mean that these changes will end up breaking the game or making it unplayable. Let's have a chat about what the GCD changes mean, which classes they affect the most, and what you can expect going forward as we get closer and closer to Battle for Azeroth's release date. So what are the global cooldown changes? Why are they such a big deal? Right now in Legion, most classes have quite a few abilities which aren't affected by the global cooldown, which means you can use them right after one another or right after a GCD spell. You can even macro a whole bunch of abilities which aren't limited to the GCD together to have them pop at the same millisecond. Usually these abilities are cooldowns, either offensive or defensive, as well as trinkets and interrupts. A great example of this is a Fury Warrior, who, if they wanted to, could activate Battle Cry, Avatar, Bloodbath, and Dragon Roar all at the same time with a single button, with a few trinkets added in for good measure. Obviously, putting all of those abilities on the GCD means you'd have to press them one at a time, which doesn't exactly make for compelling gameplay. Most other classes aren't as extreme as that, but pretty much everyone has at least one ability which will now incur a global cooldown, which didn't before, which might throw you off for a few days while you get used to the new interaction. Interrupts will remain off the GCD, so will a few other abilities we'll talk about later. On-use trinkets will also be affected by the GCD for the most part from what we've been told, so no more macroing those into other abilities too. So why would Blizzard want to throw these changes into the game if they seem like they'll do nothing but annoy pretty much everyone? Well, Ian had a pretty good explanation during the Q&A, which boils down to this change is being made for the long-term health of the game with a small sacrifice of short-term frustrations that it will likely cause. Those frustrations will go away, we'll get used to our abilities and cooldowns again, but these changes create a better combat experience to add on to later. At least, that's the hope. He brought up the power of cooldowns and specifically how stacking cooldowns creates a ridiculous power gap between your character when they have all of their cooldowns active and your character when they have no cooldowns active. The more power that's put into cooldowns, the less damage we're able to do outside of them after everything is balanced. In his PvP example, he said it sometimes didn't feel worthwhile trying to put pressure onto an enemy while you were waiting for your cooldowns to come back up because you know you probably won't be able to do anything until you do get them. But this might have a bigger impact in PvE environments. If your class has a significant portion of your damage tied to overlapping various cooldowns for a very short window of burst damage, what happens if that short window is interrupted? If you're targeted with a boss mechanic while using your cooldowns as a Fury Warrior, and you have to leave the boss's melee range, your damage just took a huge hit you're not going to recover from. The same can be said of a few other classes which are heavily cooldown reliant. It just doesn't feel great if you end up wasting your cooldowns. This also applies to some utility-based cooldowns like movement abilities or blinks. Ian talked about decision making and the GCD changes limiting your actions, so you have to make meaningful choices. If your tank needs some healing but a patch of fire just appeared under your feet, do you move and use a small instant heal? Do you use a movement cooldown and then use a larger heal? Or do you eat the fire damage and use a larger heal to make sure the tank stays alive? Depending on the choice you make, you might die, or your tank might die, or you both might survive. These outcomes would separate the better or more experienced players because they would make the right decision more often. If your movement ability isn't on the GCD, you would just use that and a large heal at the same time, which removes the potential for those moments where you really have to think on your feet. So these changes are sort of the first move in a long chess game aimed at fixing the problems that cooldowns and cooldown stacking is causing in the game. Honestly, I think the GCD changes won't affect too much overall, but I don't think this should have been the first move. If cooldowns are the main problem, why not address those first? It might be frustrating or saddening to see some cooldowns removed or toned down in power, but if your base class kit is improved to compensate, then what's the problem? I would vastly prefer that over only being able to deal meaningful damage for 10 seconds every 2 minutes. Rein in some cooldowns, maybe combine some together if they only work with being stacked, reduce the impact they have on damage, and increase the damage we deal outside of cooldowns. That would fix most of the problems that apparently led to these global cooldown changes being implemented, and then if it's still a good idea, bring the GCD changes to the table afterwards. If it's only 1 or 2 cooldowns being affected and they don't have such a strong impact on damage, the backlash from seeing these changes for the GCD in the beta probably wouldn't have been as bad. So that's the plan and the reasoning for the changes, but how does it feel in-game? After tinkering around with quite a few classes, I can say that most of it doesn't really affect anything all that much. I had a few hiccups when I was trying to recast a Frostbolt right after using Icy Veins, as that's something that's a little ingrained in my muscle memory, but it was only awkward for a few quests. I think overall casters will be affected the least by this because they're usually casting something for their entire GCD anyways. Playing most melee specs seems fine too, especially if they only have 1 cooldown to begin with. A few of the abilities which felt really bad on the GCD have actually been removed again, so at least the dev team is keeping a close eye on these changes and how they're affecting each class. Things still on the GCD include pretty much all cooldowns, so Icy Veins, Avenging Wrath, Recklessness, all the stuff which you hit and your damage goes way up. The types of abilities that were brought back off the GCD were mostly movement based. Anything with an aiming reticle I think came off the GCD, so Heroic Leap and Infernal Strike because aiming during a GCD and trying to fire it off, only for the ability to fail because you're still on GCD and you have to re-aim, is understandably frustrating and feels quite jarring. The other major movement cooldown, which is also off the GCD, is Disengage for Hunters, which allows them to fire off a shot while jumping back, which is half the reason people play Hunter to begin with. They're the only ranged class that boasts the ability to move without hindering their damage, outside of aim shot anyways, and having Disengage on the GCD kind of took away from that class fantasy. Most of these will be adjusted in a later beta build, but they're for sure not staying on the GCD. Quite a few players are worried about some defensive cooldowns that are still on the GCD. Having to time some of your defensive cooldowns might become a bit of a problem if you have a GCD in the way, though a few classes have always had their main defensive CDs on the GCD, so it might just become another game of getting used to the changes rather than the changes being inherently awful. Hopefully the tanks out there will be able to adjust to the GCD, but again, if it's absolutely unplayable, I doubt dev team would ignore the plight of our brave meat shields. Thankfully, most of the usual mitigation abilities are actually off the GCD, Demon Spikes, Ardent Defender and such, so hopefully the few that are on the GCD won't impact your gameplay too much. Personally, I think these changes are for the best, if for nothing else but to remove our dependency on cooldowns. The main reason why I stopped playing my Retribution Paladin wasn't because I didn't enjoy it. I loved Ret, I really enjoyed Prot, and Holy was at least playable, so having all 3 roles under one roof and enjoying them all for the most part was really exciting. Except Retribution relied almost solely on Crusades to deal damage. It didn't feel meaningful hitting anything outside of that huge damage spike, and if you pop your wings and you have to run away halfway through, well, I guess I'll see you in a few minutes when Wings comes back. Having most of your damage inside a small window doesn't feel great for me while playing, which is also why I have a huge problem with damage windows like Vulnerable on Marksmanship Hunters or Colossus Smash on Arms Warriors. Having a short period of huge damage is awesome while it's happening, but ultimately you have to be balanced around the fact that you're going to hit like a truck 5% of the time, which just means that your damage has to be lower for that other 95%. If this leads us to less emphasis on cooldowns, I'm all for it, but I really don't think just the GCD changes will make that happen. All it creates is a minor delay between your cooldown and your first damaging spell, or kind of breaks your class if you're a Fury Warrior. That means a few other things have to change as well for the GCD changes to be worthwhile. Any class which has a high reliance on cooldowns would have to be changed significantly going into battle for Azeroth. You can't expect people to press 4 buttons one after the other before finally getting to unleash some of that pent-up rage. Remove cooldowns, consolidate where appropriate, and reduce their overall potency, and I think we'll be in a better place. Maybe we just need to wait for them to make a few more moves on the board to get a better look at their overall strategy of how they plan to win this specific game. But whether you're a fan of these changes or not, it looks like we're all going to have to deal with them and adjust as best we can because there's no going back. They also said that they're probably as far gone as they would like to be for bringing stuff back off the global cooldown, so if it's on the global cooldown at this point, chances are it's staying there. What do you think of the GCD changes after hearing a little more reasoning behind the dev team's choices? Would you be happier with more or less emphasis on cooldowns? Leave all your thoughts in the comments section below. A big thank you to our ever-growing group of supporters over on Patreon. We're close to starting up some streaming fun, so if you want to hop on that train, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always, I will see you next time.